All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our BioTools Innovator webinar series. I'm delighted by the panelists we have today. Before that, let me give a quick intro about BioTools Innovator. We are purpose-built to support life science tools and diagnostics. We started this webinar series to bring to the forefront some major questions that startups have as they bring their products to the market. I'm really excited about today's topic. We're going to be talking about, I'm so sorry about, that's me. Okay, I'll continue there. So we have a really great panel. We're going to be talking about go-to-market strategy. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our program director, Ayelet Moreau.
Thank you, Catherine. And like Catherine said, this is a great webinar today. We have panelists that have a wealth of knowledge in this area and specifically in the life science tools market. So very proud to introduce them. I'll do a quick introduction and then let them tell us more about themselves. So we have here Stephan Goodell. He's a partner at DeciBio, a consulting firm focused on the life science industry, and he'll tell you a little bit more in a little bit. And we have Oni Nationales. She's the marketing director of clinical chemistry and immunoassays at Beckman Coulter. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to start with kind of the first question or request to have each one of you introduce yourself a little bit, tell us about yourself and the organization you work for, and specifically your expertise in the life science tools market. So let's start with Ani.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on here. So I work for Beckman Coulter Diagnostics. We are part of the Danaher family, and I work as a marketing director, leading clinical chemistry and immunoassay. We serve a very large market, over $7 billion in size. And I manage a team of marketing managers, where we focus on commercialization of new products and also driving growth of existing products through campaigns and programs.
Thank you, Ani. And I'll hand it over to Stephan.
Hi, I'm Stephan. I'm a partner at DeciBio. I have a technical background, a PhD in neuroscience, and now around 14 years of experience in management consulting, first at LEK, and then at DeciBio, which is a company that I started because I was actually waiting for an offer from Illumina, an offer that came after 4 months. And when they finally get back to me, I said, give me a second, I'm trying something. And I've been doing this for more than a decade. At DeciBio, we do strategy consulting for companies that try to transform precision medicine. And so we work a lot with tools and diagnostic companies as opposed to pharma company, because I am a firm believer that the precision medicine revolution is going to be driven by tools and diagnostics as opposed to pharma. And the best example that illustrates this is when you look at early cancer detection in companies like Grail. The reality is that for a cancer patient, the prognosis is based on stage of diagnosis, not the drug that people go under. And I also believe that with the pandemic, it's put really the tools front and center. And as a result, the world is changing. And so there is a lot of great opportunities for everyone listening on the webinar today.
Thank you, Stephan. And I think while on the topic, can you tell us a little bit more on how you engage with life science tool startups in DeciBio and what kind of work you do with them? And then I'll ask Ani the same question.
Sure. So we work with extremely large companies, as I mentioned, like Illumina, but small companies that have as little as 3 employees and tools companies. And so the way that we do this is we offer a battery of services that are just very simple market reports that are off the shelf that people can purchase if they want to understand general trends in an industry, key customer unmet need, market size, growth and trends, et cetera. And we also offer the bespoke consulting services. One thing that's unique about DeciBio, as opposed to some of the larger strategy consulting firms, is that at times we actually take equity in some of the small startups that we help as a form of payment. And so there are a couple of examples that I could share with some, more like privately with some of the companies on the line, but it's an option and something that we do that gives us a bit of skin in the game, motivates us to also maybe go the extra mile and share some connections with some of these players. But typically, people come to us at that stage because they want to try to understand what's the beachhead opportunities for their technology, and that's something that we believe strongly is very important, especially for platform technologies, to be like, well, it's a platform technology, of course, it can do everything, but tell us one thing that it can do 10 times better than anything else. What is it really enabling? And start there. And so a lot of the work that we do is that, like trying to establish that first application where you can win and win big, and there is willingness to pay.
Thank you. Anya, I'll ask you the same question. Do you have a chance to interact with small startups in your work?
Yeah, not so much in my current role, where most of our customers are within the lab or clinicians. In prior roles that I've had, I worked in sales at VWR, where nearly on a day-to-day basis, we were working with startups and delivering life science supplies to them. Not so much the refrigerators and instruments, but more the technical reagents, qPCR reagents, sequencing, and also the instruments that go along with that. So had a lot of chance to engage and provide them with the tools that they need in their research early on. Prior to that, I was at Zymo Research, which itself was a startup. So I've had that hands-on experience in the lab in developing DNA, RNA purification, and epigenetics analysis products, and then going on to do marketing and sales there. So I've worked with startups, but today my customers aren't in that area.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about go-to-market strategy. So let's dive in. First question is kind of a general question, but an important one. What are the key components of a good, solid go-to-market strategy, specifically within the life science tools industry, from your experience and from what you're seeing? We can start with Ani.
Yeah, I would say that the components actually do cross industries. So what I'm saying will apply in the life science side, diagnostic, pharma. Really, it starts with knowing who your customer is, truly understanding what that need is, that implicit need that they have. And then knowing how that fits within your company, what your capabilities are, what you can do well and what you can't do well. And a lot of the time it's easy to think of it just on the product level, right? Like, what product can I offer the customer? Customers see your company in its entirety. It's not just the product, it's even how you deliver the product, your consistency, the quality that you provide, as well as the innovation of the product. So looking at it on kind of that high, broad level is important. Knowing where you position against your competitors, where are their strengths and weaknesses. So just even doing a basic SWOT is important. Getting down a level, understanding exactly who you want to target. Who is that segment that really will jive with the products that you're providing? And knowing the messaging, the positioning that needs to come across with that. So just kind of looking at it broadly on that, like, it's really marketing 101, right? Understanding those 3 C's, the strategy, the targeting, positioning, and then very importantly, and I would say it's actually the most important part, is just execution. So how are you going to price the product, right? If you price a product too low, you can never go back up. So knowing exactly where to price that, knowing, do I need to take this through distribution or going direct, and knowing what your capabilities are versus distribution. And then also just where geographically do you want to provide this product? Is this going to start off US based? Are you going to go global? What are your skills to actually support those different geographies? So it's a very broad question, and I kind of gave you a very broad answer. I'll be happy to go into more details.
And we have very specific questions about each one of those things you mentioned. We'll definitely get to it, but we'll let Stephan jump in here.
Yeah, I agree with 100% of what Oni just mentioned. If I can try to layer in a couple of additional points, I think it's also important to understand the channels that you're going to be going after. And what I mean by that is, are you going to be going after biopharma, like the type of customers? How do you actually go after biopharma customers versus academic customers? And what is going to be your business model? Are you going to be offering a product? Are you going to be offering a service? Are you going to have some kind of early access program? And what are like the advantages and disadvantages to take this different type of approach? And in what cases does it make sense to implement an early access program, for example? It can be a good idea if you have, let's say, a lot of competition with a very hot technology that comes on the market, where speed to market matters. If speed to market matters and it's going to be a land grab, having an early access program where you can actually still do some of the work in-house before it's ready to get shipped out it's a good strategy. So I think that the business model is important. And finally, all the points that Oni mentioned, plus the channels, I would say you have to find a way to package this in a way that is actually cohesive, right? And we probably talk about this some more, like cohesiveness of a strategy is something that is very important. And the cohesiveness ties into pricing, into your customers, into their unmet need, the product, et cetera, et cetera.
Can we let me ask you, just as a follow-up, let's take a scenario of a life science tools company that has it's not uncommon to have an equipment and reagents that go with it. Can you give an example to something like this, what you were talking about in this specific scenario, and how would you package it, so to speak?
Sure, I'm happy to take a first stab. I'm sure Oni can have more to add. It's frankly the vast majority of what people sell is going to be you have the instruments and then you have the pull-through, right? It's certainly the case for sequencers, for example. And a lot of time, the way that people think about selling their sequencer is almost like a % of the price of like the reagent pull-through or vice versa, right? I think usually what you want to do is try to price the instrument, as Oni was saying. It's really hard to push price up. So you want to try to be as aggressive as you can on the onset with pricing. So if you think of the life cycle of a product, you may have seen this curve. It's kind of like I don't even know how you call this curve. It goes up, it goes back down. But you essentially have innovators, early adopter, early majority, late majority, and laggers, right? The innovators are not really price sensitive. They care about technology. They like cool techs. Like in order to actually reach the early adopters, what you need then is actually an application. It's more than a technology. It's like it's a technology that does something that's interesting. And then you have to cross the chasm. And when you cross the chasm is when you actually start to get into questions such as pricing. And it's actually, you already reach 15 to 17% of your customers before you cross that chasm, and before pricing, before like a major consideration for your customers. So as a result, it's probably a good idea to try to price things relatively aggressively based on value. And then, try to have like healthy margin on the reagent side. People don't necessarily realize that, but a company like Illumina has probably like a 95% margin on the sequencing reagents that they have. And if you want to try to continue to innovate aggressively, you need really healthy margin. And I think one of the mistakes that scientists make a lot, and that we're trying to push people away from it, is say like, oh, I can make it for $1, so I can sell it for $3, and I still have $2 to go. But it's actually, you'd be surprised about how quickly you go through that money. So pricing aggressively, I think, is, as Oni mentioned earlier, something that's important. And so I just want to make sure that I answered your question with regard to the examples. Essentially, the goal is obviously to place the box early so that then you have the reagent pull through and the service contract on the box. I guess it's like the easiest way to answer your question. Sorry about that.
No, thank you. That's great. And I see Ani nodding her head. So we'll let her add her input on this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything that Stephan said, and just having a clear understanding about what stage you're in and what your goal and your objective is at each of those stages. So when you are very early launching, trying to identify those innovators, those early adopters, but not just even as revenue, but using them also to develop case studies, to develop proof points, evidence that you could actually use later on to pull in more customers. And as again, Stephen said, those are usually not price sensitive customers, right? When you are later on and you're trying to capture everybody else, that's when you should really think about, how do I want the split to happen between the capital equipment versus the recurring revenue? And a lot of the time, reagents are not manufactured all that much. The cost isn't so high. So try and get as much as possible of that kind of recurring revenue coming through, and you have more room to play when it comes to the instrument. At least in my field with lab, a lot of the challenges isn't around the recurring revenue, where we're a razor blade business model. Majority of it is actually recurring revenue. Still, the challenge is on the instrument standpoint. So if you can find a pricing model where you can generate so much in the reagent and you don't need to sell your instruments so high, then you can get much faster adoption. I actually worked in an organization where sales reps were incented on just the instruments. And I always thought that was such an interesting thing. And I realized it's because all of that, the milk starts flowing from the cow, right? So it's important that you can place that instrument and then you can actually see a lot of the fruits of that labor.
What I would
Thank
add
you.
that it's interesting
go ahead.
is that it also varies by geography. So for example, in China, it's much easier for them to get money for capital equipment than it is to get for the reagents. So a lot of time, they actually want you to be selling the box with a lot of reagents to begin with, because it's going to be harder for them in a back end to actually get these reagents. So they tend to have like more money for capital equipment than they do, for example, in Europe. And so there are other models that you could consider, such as reagent rentals, which are pretty common in more like clinical diagnostic type settings, more than probably basic research.
Thank you. Such an interesting and important point. I think that isn't necessarily what you'd think of when you start a business here. Let me go back a little bit to a point where you mentioned in the beginning, Ani, where talking about your initial customer segment. So can you talk a little bit more about strategies to either identify to begin with, or narrowing down on this initial customer segment? How much of pre-market effort should you really put into voice of consumer before you launch?
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. The way that we have been doing it is we've had the luxury of having a sales force. So it's very easy for us to have access to customers and get their input, whether it's just a simple survey, whether it's more of a just meeting with the customer and really going deep that you can't do with a survey. I will say the easiest way to segment, if it's really important segmentation, especially as a marketer, but the easiest way to do it, if you're not going through the conjoint analysis, hiring a third-party company to do this for you, would be just SML, we call it, small, medium, large. Those are very easy. It sounds so basic, but we've actually seen the needs within our business kind of adjust to the volume that the customer is using. So I'm not saying this applies to all markets, but in ours, we see that within the small lab segment, for example, they have very hard time trying to find full-time employees, med technologists to work with them. And so when we position products, it's all about how easy it is, how simple, versus a large customer that we're working with. Maybe they're an IDN, they're like a hub and spoke model where there's a central lab with multiple labs. We talk about standardization of products. So I think using this SML simple model to start off and tying those to needs is actually a really, I think, a foolproof way of addressing your market.
Thank you, Stephan. Anything to add on this?
Yeah, I agree. I think segmentation is important. Like SML certainly sounds like a very easy way to get this done. There is a book from Clay Christensen called Competing Against Luck, which is quite interesting, which recommends trying to segment your customers not based on the location, for example, pharma versus academia versus clinical, but based on their behavior. because their needs is probably closer based on how they behave than where they're located. So that's a pretty interesting read for people interested in segmentation. In terms of the voice of customer, it's interesting because in part, like my job is to do voice of customer. And that's what a lot of what consultants do. But the reality is that for startup, we actually recommend that they do that themselves. It's actually very important for you to talk to your customers, obviously, and to try to see what are their exact needs, what's the willingness to pay, and what's going to be the volumes. And so once you actually get a sense of they're going to buy the box, here's the volume and how much they're willing to pay, it can really help you guide your go-to-market strategy. And it can help you understand what market segments is the most attractive to get started. You can actually try to have a menu strategy, which is like, well, let's say that they actually start with that one application. What's next for them? Now that they have the box, what is like the next set of application that we can actually put on the box? And if you find out that you arrive in some kind of dead end, they're like, well, they get the box, that's one application, and then they can't do anything with that box, then you're probably better off actually picking another application that have a more runway. I think Cepheid actually, which is a Danaher company, obviously, Oni is very familiar with, has done that extremely well with their MRSA test. They had a test for MRSA, which essentially was like the good enough reason for a hospital to have like fast turnaround time on a clinical diagnostic test using PCR. And then they just started to expand the menu. And now I think they have more than 30 different tests. And it's an expensive test, but the convenience is so high. It's kind of like this catch and kit that you have in your lab, right? It's just water and salt, but you get to pay $300 or $400 for one of these boxes because it's convenient. You have it, you know how to use it. So I think it's important, the bottom line, to do that voice of customer and to try to identify who are the people who are willing to pay for what you offer. Not simply the people who actually say, well, yeah, it would be really helpful and we'll use it a lot. If you can actually make $1 million from 10 customers, it's much better than making $1 million for 100 customers. It's going to be far less headache in the back end.
And a point to just add to what Stephan's saying is speaking to the customer directly is best. Going to watch the customer interact with your product and with competitive products is next level. That gives you so many insights into kind of what they like about it, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are for you. So just kind of watching them, being that fly on the wall is a best practice.
I'll add something to that. That's fascinating to mention that. So there is this PCR company, I'm trying to remember the name, I think it was MJ, and they had a hard time gaining traction in the market and they didn't quite understand why. And what was happening is that they have a very flimsy lid at the bottom of their PCR machine. And then people were like, well, I'm never sure if like it's going to evaporate because like, you know, I'm not sure my tubes are all closed in my 96 well plates. And so what they did next, as they realized that, is they just added that massive lid on top that you would lock, that would go like clunk. And then people are like, oh, I can tell it's closed. You know, it's kind of like a BMW's door, you're like shutting down. And so when you really watch people in the way they behave, it can be extremely insightful. So I like that point a lot, Ani.
Thank you both. I think it's great advice. Let's take it one step further. Let's say that we have identified that initial customer segment. Given really limited resources for startup companies, what would you say are the most promising tactics for customer acquisition, at least in the first stages? Well, let's start with Stephan this time. Go ahead.
So for customer acquisition, like I think like, you know, Oni might be actually better positioned to answer that question. I'll tell you from my personal expertise, but it's on a consulting side, not as much on a tech side. I find it's that when I look at some of my clients that have the impression are the most successful, they actually attend a fair number of conferences, but they don't necessarily get a booth. I actually don't think that you need a booth to make the most out of these conferences. Actually, I think that getting a booth is in some sense almost a waste of money and a waste of time, to be honest. I think that you're much better off actually going there and meeting with people, meeting with clients. And also what I've observed myself is a lot of what's happening in the discussion and the partnerships actually happen after hours. And so it's like finding what are like the places that people go to continue to discuss about this. And there are like some conferences that are known to be a little bit more social in nature. And so if you are the type of person who actually does really well in that type of unstructured environments where you just have like, a drink in your hand and you talk to people, it's something to consider. I think like ultimately what matters, and maybe I should have started there, it's important to figure out what maps best to the environment where you're the most comfortable yourself. Maybe you're a scientist and you love the science and you have that passion. And when you have a poster, you're in front of your poster, this is when you're at your best. And that means that this is what you need to do. You need to put yourself in situations where you're at your best. Maybe it's, as I said, it's like a conference, or maybe it's giving a talk. Maybe it's actually going and to see your client themselves or talk to the scientists. So figure out what works best for you and do that. That would be my recommendation.
A quick follow-up on that. Any recommendations on how to really kind of prioritize these type of events? Where do you find the right event to be in, or conference or fair, whatever it is?
Think absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important to find a conference. It's not necessarily the largest one that are the best. Actually, I would say in some sense the largest one, like, you know, when I go to ASCO, for example, I find like it's just so busy. It's extremely clinical in nature, and people go there actually for the talks and to hear the readout of the trials. So this is not really a good conference for tools companies, I don't think. There is a conference called SITC, which is on the East Coast. And some of these smaller conferences that might have only a couple hundred people. And I think going to conferences like this, it's much more intimate. You get to meet the people. So going to small conferences that are highly relevant to your field probably makes more sense than going to SFN, Cell Bio, or ASCO, in my opinion.
Thank you. And we'll go back to Anya with the broader question first on promising tactics for customer acquisition.
Yeah, just to speak to some of the points Stephan made, I would say that going to conferences are indeed very important. And it depends kind of what stage you are within your, I guess, business that will dictate the activity. If you're very early on, a booth might not make too much sense, especially if you don't have kind of the capabilities on the back end to follow up on some of the leads. It might be a waste of time. I will say that if you have the opportunity to make a presentation or even a poster presentation, that's great. Or having the opportunity to interact and maybe try and woo some of the KOLs in your field, again, is a really good use of your time at a conference versus having a booth. Later on, when you are more established, you have maybe a sales team or distribution team that you can work with, absolutely go ahead, get a booth, set up your lead management process. That is extremely important. A lot of companies go to conferences, they obtain some interest, and then what happens to the customer list? Nothing, it just sits there. If you are disciplined about having a process where you either hire a third-party company to call these people up, you provide them with a script, follow up and really try to qualify those opportunities before you go in yourself. Once you have that commercial engine going, it's extremely lucrative, it's extremely efficient, and it's something that could be applied everywhere. And that's something that I've set up in companies that I've worked in. On the outside of trade shows and conferences, there's so many ways that you can engage with customers. And we're seeing more and more these days, especially catalyzed by COVID, customers doing much more research. They get through the buying journey a lot faster before you get in contact with them, especially before a salesperson gets in touch with them. So meeting your customer in the virtual world, you proactively going up and setting up webinars. There's so many companies out there that can help you do this. And to provide you with email lists where you can capture customer interest and set up a webinar, using your website, using Google Ads. Customers actually, we've noticed, especially our lab customers, don't particularly want to see salespeople as much as they did before. And again, that's part of that is due to COVID. So meeting them where they are, there are a lot of Facebook groups of postdocs and fellows and everyone who's on there. Get yourself on there, and that's a very easy way of promoting your products. So just not discounting the virtual world is my advice to you.
Thank you, thank you. That's I
as well. I've noticed right now I'm actually I'm on a couple of WhatsApp panels as well. It's quite remarkable. There's a lot of activity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we've noticed not just our business, but just within the industry, just that tilt much more online. And so I highly encourage it. It's actually a lot less expensive than going to a conference, and the cost of acquisition is lower.
Oni, do you have a sense of what is your recommendation about when is the scale or the size of your company when you can start to actually go and get a booth at a trade show? What, like, do you have a guesstimate?
I worked at a company called Zymo Research. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with that if you're in the genetic space. And we started off pretty early. I'd say when the company was roughly around even 20 people, 30 people is when we started going to conferences. But you said something very important earlier, which is understanding what your capabilities are, right? The types of people we hired at Zymo were very outgoing, even though we were scientists also. And so when we were at the booth, we were the types of people who would go and socialize and meet and have that martini with others. So we kind of capitalized on the trade show opportunity, not just the booth opportunity. And in addition, samples were extremely important for our strategy. Just provide, like Kaijin were the biggest competitor, and providing those samples and challenging your customers to test those products was, I would say, 70% contribution to why Zymo was so successful. So if you're in that kind of space where you're allowed to provide products for customers to test, and you trust in the quality of your product, I think that that could be a really good strategy for you.
Great advice.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's dive a little bit into pricing strategy. So what would you say, how do you get started in building your pricing strategy, in a life science tools company? Is there some sort of a playbook? What type of market research needs to go into it, or any other major steps that you would say you need to do before you start building your pricing strategy? Let's start with Stephan.
Yeah, so there are a number of pricing framework that you can Google and that would pop up that exist. I think one mistake that people make in biotech and elsewhere is to do cost-based pricing, which is never the right way to do this, which is like, well, it costs us X, so let's sell it for 3X. You should obviously sell based on the value that you provide. And a lot of time that value can be tried to achieve by comparing how much it would cost by doing it like the old way. You can say, like, for example, I have a friend who actually developed a multiplex Western blot technology that enables you to do 500 antibodies at the same time. It's like, well, how much would it cost if you were to run 500 Western blot? And then that gives you a sense of what are the goalposts of, like, well, how much does it cost us? That's the bottom. And how much value does it cost? And then you actually try to talk to people and see what is the willingness to pay depending on the application that they go after. I think one of the mistakes that we've already talked about that people make is to price too low because they want to have like really fast adoption. I think it's a mistake. Actually, we talked about it to a number of people at mid-size tools companies that also are completely against this idea of giving the box away for free. If you give away something for free, it's going to sit somewhere in a corner. It's not going to get used. People just assign value to what they pay. And so you want to get customers who are willing to pay for your products. Again, then it's just, frankly, it's just as much instinct as it is like trying to be smart about just looking, for example, what are some of the cutoff for grants? It's like, well, like people might tell you like, well, if it's more than $75,000 now, I don't have like, I need to get into that next, like, I can't remember what S2 grant or whatever is that NIH grant that you can get. And so, well, if you have a product that you can price somewhere between 50 and 100K based on like the research that you've done, maybe pricing it just under 75 actually makes sense. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Maybe I'll turn it back to Oni to make a couple of comments. And if something else comes to mind, I'll let you know.
Go ahead, Oni.
Yeah, I think that cost-based pricing does have its place, and it's more kind of like where I shouldn't go below. That's pretty much the purpose of it if I want to be profitable. I will say that looking at your competitive pricing is always helpful. So that kind of goes along with speaking to your customers, understanding how much they've been willing to pay, understanding what you want your brand to be. A lot of the time, there's kind of like this sliding scale that consumers, well, or our customers could have, where if your product is priced higher, they associate that with quality. And if it's very low, they might think, it's not really worth much. It's a cheap product. So just understanding how you want to position yourself in the market should also be a factor in your pricing. But when I'm doing pricing, a lot of the time it's looking at where our competitors are and having a good understanding of the products that they're delivering, what the strengths are versus weaknesses as it relates to my product, and then positioning it in that way. The market I'm working in today is extremely established. There's no way somebody will buy an instrument and just put it to the side. So I know that the product is going to be used. It's just at what pricing can we have the highest value and kind of maintain our brand image and not be seen as a cheap, low cost, poor quality product.
I want to pick on that a little bit because you mentioned earlier the razor blade pricing strategy for and a lot of the life science tools, it's very common. So how does that fit with what you're saying on don't price things too low when it comes to this kind of a little bit more complex model?
Yeah, I would say in that context, our reagents are not going to, like your reagent is not going to be the cheapest, right? You have to make the money back somewhere. And when I talk about giving the box or the instrument at a lower price, still it shouldn't be something that is lower than the cost of producing it. So the different models that you can have out there, you can have a lease model where a customer can lease the product, like you lease a car. You can have a different model where it's you have to purchase X quantity of reagent, X dollars of reagent. Or you can have just like the cash buyout of the instrument. So there's so many different pricing models that you can have. At the end of the day, as long as you are above that kind of threshold in profitability that you're setting for yourself, and it's fitting in with the way you want your business to be perceived, then be flexible. I have to say though, on the back end of setting up these different price models, there's a lot of administration that might need to happen with it. So if your business isn't set up to be monitoring the amount of reagents a customer is buying, there's no point, right? And if you don't have the auditing process in place. So you don't just think about it at the start of the business, but how this could be sustainable.
Thank you. Stephan, anything else you'd want to add on this?
Yeah, I was gonna add, you can also think about what's an entry point for your product and what is it that you can ask and add a premium on. And so, like an example, an easy one would be some, maybe complex bioinformatics. If there is like some bioinformatic tools that you can use, maybe you may be able to actually charge for that, although people typically don't like to pay for bioinformatics. But maybe there's actually an assay that have been validated. For example, if you sell GMP product and GMP grade products, now you can sell them at a significant premium. So trying to think about what's the base and maybe you offer a solution and then you have like a validated kit that look at a subset of cytokines or look at something specific, which people might be willing to pay a premium for.
Yeah, and actually just outside of the reagents itself, something we're seeing happening more and more, not just in our industry, just across the board, is charging more for service. So having packages where you're charging for preventative maintenance, those annual checkups of your instruments, or even calling someone to fix the box. So, and on top of that, the software that could be added to the box. And we're seeing a lot more revenue being generated from the service standpoint, not just from the reagent or box standpoint.
Yeah, and these service contracts, it really adds up, right? And people actually, the beauty of it is it tends to be, and only you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's in the 10 to 15% range of the price of the instruments per year, right, that people pay. Yeah. And so call it 12%. And what that means is that after 5 years, like the install base grows to an extent that it's, this 12% of a 5-year install base now, like actually can be quite significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. To another question related to pricing strategy. Sorry, when would you say is a good time to start working on your pricing strategy, or more to it, to really nail it down?
I can take a stab at this. I would say very, very early on, when you're doing your go-to-market strategy, when you're doing your business plan, you want to see 5, 10 years what your revenue is going to look like, right? So for that, you need to know your pricing. It doesn't mean it's not going to change with new information, but early on, that is a key component, and it should be started as early as possible, and connecting with customers early to just see even what that baseline could look like. There's a lot of assumptions that are put into a model, and using, I'm sure you guys have these resources at UCLA, using maybe finance students to help you build out those models is a very valuable resource. But I would say early on in the process is when you should start.
Is there a too early point where you would make a mistake if you would start looking at your pricing strategy?
I think when you know what kind of how you want to do the commercialization execution part of your business. So if you're going to be working with a distributor and they'll be taking margin, and if it's going to be resource intensive to actually develop the product, having those early inputs as far as cost of your business. I keep talking about not using cost-based model for pricing, but using it as kind of like a threshold for at least where you should be. Have those basics points first before you start working on pricing, just so that you have some kind of real data that you're working with, and it's not just all assumption and guess.
Thank you, Stephan. Anything on that?
Yeah, I agree 100%. You have to start to think about it early, simply because, as we said, your overall strategy has to be cohesive. And I think Oni just also mentioned, like, well, we think about pricing early because we don't want to dilute the brand. So, if you decide to go, we're going to be the low-cost solution for digital PCR. Like, then there is like a number of decisions that you're going to have to make down the road that, that come along with that. And I think there is a lot of analogy, like there's a bunch of like HBR articles that you can read about, like Southwest, for example, and the decisions that they've made and why. I'm trying to remember if it was Delta or one of these companies that tried to compete on low cost, but they just simply couldn't because they had the infrastructure of a large, like, multinational global airline company, and you just can't compete. So you have like decisions that you make on certain things, such as like pricing, customer type, channels, business model. These things has to be cohesive, and it trickles. It works together. Either you can be like white glove service at low cost. It's like these things have to tie.
Thank you. A quick detour on pricing strategy. Do you see benefits in using an outside agency to consult on pricing strategy, or should this be done internally within the team?
I think it can get done internally, but like if there are like actually consulting firms that specialize on pricing, and so if you're not sure what to do it and you feel like it's a point of contention and there is not a lot of alignment internally, then maybe you can actually rely from people on the outside. I mean, every time you rely on people on the outside, it's quite expensive. These type of studies can be expensive, so I'd be thoughtful about doing it. Like we've done it in the past ourselves, but as I said, it's not cheap.
It gets expensive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
No, completely agree with every single word. It can get extremely expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth expensive. So I think spending the time with your customers, doing surveys, will get you a good part of the way there. So just if you want to allocate so much to an outside service, They give you great data, and actually sometimes more than you ask for. They will also do the segmentation for you. So it's a really good data and information you're receiving. It just comes at a very heavy price.
Thank you.
The real reason to do it
ahead.
on the outside, as I touched on that already, is if it actually completely ties to the strategy and there is like a big dissonance where, you know, there is a group of people who say, hey, we think it should be a $10,000 instruments and it costs us only $5,000 or $7,000 to make it. So let's try to have this flood the market with the box. And then some other people say like, no, let's sell that instrument for $100,000 to biopharma to do blah, 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 blah. So if it really ties to the strategy and then there is that friction, then it becomes more than just a pricing strategy project. And it's when it starts to make sense to actually bring people from the outside if you can't resolve that internally.
And probably ties back into how much market information you actually have internally. So depending on that as well.
Before you go into these third-party companies to do pricing for you, there are other companies that can just provide you with the competitive pricing. So there's kind of a middle ground. It doesn't even have to be all or nothing. You can pay for those market reports or those other tools that can help you get yourself there too.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to jump into a little bit of a different topic now to talk about sales and marketing strategy. For a lot of our companies, how would you get started on deciding between a direct sales model and partnering with a distributor in the case of life science tools? Ani, go ahead. Try first.
I'll use Zymo Research as an example of a company that was very good at using marketing, digital marketing specifically, to get to their customers without having a direct sales force, and with not strong alliances with distributors in North America. So I talked about the sampling program that was, I'd say, essential for Zymo Research to be a successful company. And using email blasts, Google ads, LinkedIn posts, videos are cheap to make. All of those enabled awareness and leads to be driven to our website and for us to kind of follow up with those customers. So I don't think that you need to have a sales force or distribution early on. I do think that distributors are helpful when it comes to a product that maybe isn't so complicated. Distributors have hundreds and thousands of products to provide, and their sales reps are incented by how much those suppliers provide programs for them. So, for example, some of the distribution companies I've worked with or I have worked for, they had a special tier of suppliers where you provide samples, where you provide extra sales and educational resources, where you provide what they call maybe like spiff programs, where it's like incentives to the sales reps. And that's really where the sales reps focus will be, more so than on maybe some of the other product lines they have. So there are ways of working with distributors where it can be strong, but at the same time, their mind share is split between so many products that it can have a diluting effect. So if you have a simple product and you're just trying to reach the masses, distribution is a good approach to consider. If your product is very specific, you might want to consider having more like maybe MDs or PhDs, like a medical and scientific affairs or clinical affairs team supporting you. So it really depends on your product and the overall strategy.
Just as a quick follow-up, any recommendations in the case that you are going with distributors? Any thoughts on distributors that you've had positive experience with?
Well, I'm biased because I worked for VWR. No, but I think that so of course the two major ones would be VWR and Fisher. in this space, but there's a lot of other smaller ones that you can work with. And while the name has just fallen out, I will remember and communicate that later. But there are lots of small distributors who have focus still in the types of customers that you're interested in, like in the labs. And they actually have fewer products than the big VWR switches out there. So you do get more of their mind share. And also, if you're going global and you're based here in the US, using distributors is a really good way of reaching customers, whether it's just for access to those new geographies.
Thank you. Stephan, anything to add on this?
Sure, I'll add a couple of things, but I think Oni just nailed it. Really, I agree 100% with what she said. The global reach is probably one of the key reasons why people decide to start to use distributors. And if you look, even going in China, you'd be like, oh, let's use a distributor in China. It's like, no, you probably don't need one, you need 10. And China is extremely fragmented. And so thinking that you can just get away with one distributor in China is wrong. So you need a lot of distributors if you want to actually start to cover ex-US. There are also a lot of interesting subtleties. So we work with a company, which I'm sure of the publicity. They're called MyBio. They're based in Ireland. And one of their strength is biopharma relationships. They have great biopharma relationship in Ireland. And as it turns out, like because of tax advantages, there are a lot of biopharma companies that have like their R&D teams based in Ireland. And as a result, like knowing of like these little companies that have like this really niche type of access that you may not necessarily expect, it's a good way to, as I said, not having to build these relationships. As far as the US, if you're a US-based company, the reality is that you should be like the handful of people starting this company should be kind of like the salesman in my mind. Like you're your best salesman, you believe it, you go and talk to the key opinion leaders, you actually get them to adopt the platforms. As soon as you actually start to gain traction, you try to get someone who really is competent, can be the face of the company, and can, essentially travel up and down the West Coast. And then you get someone up and down the East Coast, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can actually, I think, really assemble the sales team piecemeal in a way that doesn't have to be, taking a big chunk of your operating budget. And if somehow you need to bleed scale and grow extremely rapidly, then sure, you can actually try to do that rapidly. But the reality, I think, is, as Oni mentioned, is very important to make sure that the people selling your product are properly trained. And we've come a number of times into companies that have used distributors or partners or collaborators to sell complex products, and it just falls apart really rapidly. So I try to give you an example, a very specific example. Let's say that you are diagnostic companies that offer a test for rare disease, like some kind of like whole genome sequencing test for rare disease. And then you're going to go to a company like Quest or LabCorp or BioReliance. I'm not picking on any of them. These guys make billions of dollars every year selling tests for chlamydia and gonorrhea and a bunch of different things. And your little test is not going to be top of mind. It's hard to sell. And they're just not trained in order to be selling something that's that complex and specialized. So that touches to what Oni was saying earlier, that if it's something simple, then sure, they can add it to the bag, don't need a lot of training, and they can push it through. But if it's a complex sale and it's a complex product, you do need either your own sales force, or you do need to find a way to work with that company in order to train them and work with them so that they can sell that product, and that you perfectly align incentives. And what that means often is that you need to be of similar scale in terms of how much you feel like you can bring in terms of, it has to be meaningful for them, for the relationship to work out.
Thank you. I think this is a very important point that has to be made, because a lot of these products are not necessarily straightforward. So thank you for that. I think we're almost kind of coming up at the hour, so can't end a marketing or go-to-market strategy webinar without asking that question. What percentage of your budget in an early stage should be spent on marketing? Stephan, go ahead.
I really don't have a good answer for this one. It's a really tough one. Like in my mind, it should be actually a relatively small amount. Actually, I think that early on, a lot of success is about execution, right? It's really an execution game, and so you should try to actually be spending the money in ways that actually get you to, get your product in your hand of customers and a product that people can use that is reproducible. And the reality is that I think that like the marketing budget early on should be actually relatively small. I think it's kind of counterintuitive, given that I'm a consultant. I think people spend probably more energy than they should worrying about the exact market size or the total addressable market. And the reality is that when you're a startup and you have 5 people in the lab, if your total addressable market is 10 billion or 100 billion, it doesn't matter. It's big and you have a lot of work to do. And so I don't think that it's like necessary to be like agonizing over something that's a log. It's not, it's meaningful, right? And investors are going to want to know. But I would say, to me, marketing is not as important as some of the, as execution in my mind.
Thank you, Ani.
That's hard to hear, Stephen, as a marketer.
Sorry.
I had a feeling this would be.
No,
yeah.
I said for a startup. I said for a startup.
Yeah,
it's different in your shoes.
I do agree very early on, marketing, quote unquote, isn't as important as making sure that you can set up your operations and you can actually develop and deliver your product to customers, and just building those early relationships with those innovators and early adopters. I will say, though, that there's studies, there's a number of HBR ones that show there's a positive correlation between your marketing budget and the revenue that you do generate with that. I would say that early on, you need to be smart about how you're using your money, and understanding, even asking those initial early adopters, who else are the customers? Who are the other you to find? And using kind of your marketing budget to target those people. But as you go along, again, using digital, virtual channels to reach customers is a low cost but more and more effective way of acquiring customers.
Should we take a stab at what percent it is? Like, I'll tell you the number I had in mind. My number was like probably the 5% range is my gut feeling. But as I said, I don't know. Oni, you have a better number?
I think 5% is fine, but honestly, it really depends what it is you're trying to do, right? I would say probably 5 to 10% would be good. 5 was actually the number I was thinking of, also on the low end. But I would say that there needs to be context to it, and what are you trying to achieve at that stage in your business? So it's a very hard question to answer.
It is. Thank you for trying to answer that. So we're ending the live stream soon. So just before we do that, any last piece of advice related to go-to-market strategy? Anything to avoid? Kind of a takeaway message from this?
I'll say one thing, which is a pretty general advice, but I think it's important for people to actually think about crafting a very good story that resonates with investors and resonates with customers, like the variety of stakeholders that you have, like something that really grabs people when they feel like, oh, wow, that's a good story. And we worked with a company recently that raised less than 10 million pounds and sold for like more than $400 million, like 2 years later. And the reason why they did that is, of course, they had a great technology and they had a great team, but it's also they had a great story to tell. And so I think people kind of like underestimate the power of a good story. So I would encourage, everyone on the call to be thinking through this. What's my story and how can I improve it?
Thank you. Ani, last
really
piece of
good one.
advice?
I would say that it's never too early to start developing the processes in which your company uses to get products to market, and just in delivering a consistent product. I think that, especially coming from Danaher and seeing sometimes, like in our history, impact of how delivery impacts customer satisfaction, and just thinking of the customer experience, and how important it is to retain customers. It's so much cheaper, easier to retain an existing customer than to lose them, which is extremely expensive. So just building in processes that support a good customer experience, a good user experience earlier on, and having that be repeatable, having that scalable is extremely important, and I think not talked about enough.
Thank you so much.
I get actually
Stephan?
one more,
Go ahead.
maybe just like one last one that comes to mind is challenge yourself as to whether you have the right business model. I think it's interesting that once you have the product and you have the tools, ask yourself, do I really want to sell the tool, or can I build a service company around it? And because like in some sense, like maybe the tool is not differentiated, but you can create a set of workflow, and the innovation doesn't come from the tools themselves as much as the sequencing of the different tools that you have. And if you create a service that's differentiated because part of the tool is differentiated, it's something that could be interesting. A company that comes to mind is Complete Genomics. And what they did, they were like, well, you know what, we can do whole genome sequencing, human whole genome sequencing, even more narrow than that, probably better than Illumina. Setting the sequencer, setting human whole genome sequencing as a service. It flopped, but it was still a good idea. And
I think we might have lost Stephen.
Yeah, I think we might have lost Stephan here, but we are. Go ahead, Anya.
One more thing,
yeah.
now that we're kind of on a roll, is making sure that scope creep doesn't happen. It's something that I'm seeing, and I actually saw in my past when I worked with startups, is you want to try and boil the ocean and do everything. Stay focused on what you're good at, what your capabilities are, what you're unique at, and do that really well. And then later on, you can start adding more things to it. But it's just kind of a pitfall that I've seen in the past.
Thank you. I think we have Stephan back. I think, not sure. Okay, we'll take that opportunity to thank both of you and move to the private session with our cohort companies and end the live stream. Thank you everyone for joining us here. I sure learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did as well.